So how do conservatives respond to the alleged historical errors that the critical view uses to say that the book of Daniel is fictional rather than history and that its prophecies may be inaccurate? Well, in terms of the problem of Darius the Mede, it's true that we have no evidence outside the Bible that Darius the Mede existed. But there's at least a plausible alternative, and that's to say that Darius is a throne name for somebody else that we do know. Now, there's been proposed either Guburu I or Guburu II, both being governors of Babylon early under Cyrus, might be the identification of Darius the Mede, that they may have assumed as governors throne names of Darius. I think the most likely view, though, is that Cyrus and Darius are the same person. That Cyrus was Median in descent, as Darius the Mede is said to be, because his mother was a Mede, though his father was a Persian. Cyrus went on to conquer the much larger Median Empire. In fact, he defeated his own grandfather, Astyages, and took over that Median Empire. Persia had been a vassal of the Median Empire. And so it would be natural for him to assume a Median throne name. And so he could be called Cyrus the Persian or Darius the Mede. As far as Belshazzar probably was a grandson of Nebuchadnezzar through his mother. Nabonidus' wife, the mother of Belshazzar, was very arguably one of Nebuchadnezzar's daughters. And thus, Belshazzar would have been a son of, in the sense of grandson, and in Hebrew sometimes son of can mean descendant of. Well, if that's the case, then Belshazzar would have been a grandson of Nebuchadnezzar through his mother, even though Nabonidus was not biologically related. This would perhaps explain why Nabonidus, who was not biologically related to Nebuchadnezzar, managed to succeed the descendants of Nebuchadnezzar on the throne. If he was married to a daughter of Nebuchadnezzar, he could have claimed some legitimacy through his wife. Critical scholars also claim that the prophecy of Daniel 11, verses 36 through 45 failed. What happens in Daniel 11 is that it gives a remarkably accurate account of intertestamental events, first of all with the Persians and the Greeks, but then particularly in the Greek period, all the way down to the time of Antiochus IV, who, as we said, tried to abolish Judaism. But then when you get at the end of chapter 11, it describes the doings of Antiochus, and Antiochus is said to have invaded Ethiopia, but in fact he did not. Antiochus is said to have died in Palestine, when in fact he died in Persia. And so liberal critical scholars will say, well, this is where the history ends, history in the guise of prophecy, and real prediction begins. But when he actually makes a real prediction, the author fails. And thus you can date the book to the time of Antiochus because of this particular failed prophecy. How do conservatives respond? They would say that the book of Daniel in chapter 11 goes through the time of Antiochus, but then it jumps to the figure that Antiochus foreshadows, namely what the New Testament calls the Antichrist. And thus it's not failed prophecy, but prophecy that it has yet to be fulfilled. At least one little piece of evidence in favor of this is that it immediately goes on in chapter 12 to talk about the resurrection of the just and the unjust at the end of the age. And so jumping to the end of the age here is not unreasonable. A little bit about the theology of the book. Again, critical matters, I have a much more detailed and scholarly thing that I'm having you read, but it doesn't have the theology. So just let me mention a few things theologically about Daniel. First of all, in the narratives give a message of how God's people need to be faithful to God despite a hostile pagan environment. So in Daniel 1, Daniel refuses to eat the king's food because either it's been offered to idols or because it was non-kosher, not according to the Jewish food laws. And so that was an example of his needing to be faithful despite the environment that he found himself in Babylon. You get the same thing in Daniel 3, where Daniel's three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, refused to bow down to the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up and commit idolatry. And therefore they were willing to be thrown into the fiery furnace rather than do that. You also have the theology of the faithfulness to God despite the environment in chapter 6, where Daniel was willing to be thrown into a lion's den rather than quit praying 3 times a day, as was his custom. In Daniel 4 and Daniel 5, you have the humbling of human pride. In Nebuchadnezzar's case, in Daniel 4, Nebuchadnezzar was very proud of his accomplishments, and God humbled him, sending him into madness, where he ate grass like cattle. He was warned of this in a vision, in a dream, where he would be like a great tree that would be cut down. But at the end, when he acknowledges God, he would be restored. And Daniel 4 gives that account. Daniel 5 is another account of the humbling of human pride. In this case, Belshazzar arrogantly and in a sacrilegious way used the sacred temple vessels for a drunken orgy. And the punishment was that the Persians were to be taken over. That was the message of the handwriting on the wall that Daniel was able to interpret. As far as the prophecies, they also have much theological value. The prophecies tell us about the foreknowledge of God, that God is a supernatural revealer of mysteries. In Daniel 2:27-28, Daniel answered before the king and said, "As for the mystery about which the king has inquired, neither wise man, conjurers, magicians, or diviners are able to declare it to the king. However, there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what will take place in the latter days." This theme is also developed by all the supernatural predictions. You'll see more in Daniel 8 and Daniel 11, where God previews much of intertestamental history. And of course, if you take the critical view that it's all prophecy after the fact, that would undermine the very thing that Daniel is teaching here. We also see something about the sovereignty of God, that God is able to control history to fulfill the prophecies of the nations, that there will be kingdoms that will arise up in accordance with his will, that he will send the Christ, the one like the Son of Man figure, to establish the kingdom of God at the end of the age. The theme of the ultimate victory of the kingdom of God is found in Daniel 2 and in Daniel 7. In Daniel 2, Nebuchadnezzar has a prophetic dream of a statue of 4 types of materials. And according to the conservative view of things, the 4 materials represent Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. But that statue would be smashed to smithereens by a stone cut without hands. That represents the kingdom of God and perhaps even Christ himself, who will put down the kingdoms of the world and establish the kingdom of God. The nations then will come and go in accordance with God's decrees, but they are all destined for destruction, to be replaced by the kingdom of God. There's more on that in Daniel 7, where you have 4 beasts that come out of the sea that correspond with Nebuchadnezzar's dream of chapter 4. Again, the head of gold is Babylon, and that's the first beast. And then the breast of silver is the same as the second beast, Medo-Persia. The belly of bronze is the third beast, the leopard, the Greek kingdom. And the legs of iron is the fourth beast, the Roman Empire. And again, these kingdoms are going to come and go. There's going to be an evil figure, the little horn, which conservatives identify with the Antichrist, who's going to make war against the saints. That figure appears again, we believe, at least, in Daniel 11:36 through 45, which is not Antiochus IV, but rather the same Antichrist figure at the end of the age. Now, this Daniel 7 has a messianic aspect of it. Daniel 7:13, I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, one like a son of man was coming. And he came before the Ancient of Days, and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion, glory, and a kingdom, that all the peoples, nations, and men of every language might serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will not be destroyed. Now, critical scholars uniformly try to avoid messianic interpretation here. They say this is only a symbol of Israel, or this is some sort of angel, maybe like Michael or Gabriel. But the New Testament clearly applies it to Jesus Christ. Caiaphas, when Jesus is in trial before Caiaphas, he asks him, are you the Christ? And he says, I am, and you will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven. Jesus clearly identified himself with this Son of Man figure. Now, it is true that the kingdom will go to the saints, to the holy ones, that's Israel, but it's kind of like this, that Israel is both the king, the Son of Man, and his subjects, the saints. And here the emphasis is on the king of the kingdom, the Son of Man figure, who in a godlike way, because after all he is the Son of God as well as the Son of Man, appears before the Ancient of Days. Other themes in Daniel we can mention. There's unseen spiritual warfare between angels and demons, or Michael and a certain unnamed angel in chapter 10, and territorial demons, the king of Persia and the prince of Persia and the prince of peace. Read about that in Daniel 10. The book says something about the power of prayer, as God answers prayer throughout the book, and you also have in Daniel 9 a long prayer confession, giving us an example of prayer. And then you also have at the end of the book a reference to the resurrection at the end of the age, at the last judgment. In Daniel 12:2 and 3 it says, multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, others to shame and everlasting contempt. Those who are wise will shine like the brightness of the heavens, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. This is the first unambiguous reference to the resurrection of the dead in the Old Testament. If we had more time, we would talk about one of the more ambiguous prophecies in the book of Daniel, and muchly debated, the 70 weeks passage of Daniel 9:24 through 27. Critical scholars will apply this passage to the days of Antiochus, whereas conservative scholars will either apply it to the first coming of Christ, what's called the Roman view, or to the second coming. Dispensationalists do that.